She thought she was invisible, just another woman with a mop and a secret, moving through the glass towers of Manhattan like a ghost. But he had been watching her every single morning from 40 floors up, memorizing the way she walked, the way she stopped for strays, the way she carried coffee she could barely afford. He never spoke to her. He didn't need to, not yet. Then one night, he cornered her in the rain and saw the bruises she'd been hiding under her makeup for months. That was the night Lucien Devereaux stopped being patient. If you want to know what happened when the most feared man in New York declared war on a criminal syndicate for one woman who never even knew his name, stay until the very end. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. This is Sienna and Lucien's story. And it starts the night everything changed. The rain came down in sheets, not the polite Manhattan drizzle that office workers tilted their umbrellas against on their way to dinner. This was the kind of rain that had weight behind it, that soaked through a jacket in 30 seconds and turned every alley into a shallow river. The kind of rain that made people move faster and look at each other less, which was exactly what Sienna Vale needed tonight. She came out the service entrance of Hargrove Tower at 11:43, the same exit she always used, the same route she always took, east on 54th, then down to the Lexington Avenue subway, head low, earbuds in, don't make eye contact with anyone. 6 months of the same walk and she had it mapped in her muscles by now. She knew which blocks had working streetlights and which ones didn't. She knew which doormen liked to stare too long. She knew where to cross early to avoid the group of men who sometimes gathered outside the Korean barbecue place on the corner. She knew how to be invisible. The mop bucket had been heavy tonight. Third-floor bathroom flooding again, busted seal on the men's room near the elevator bank. And she'd spent 2 extra hours dealing with the overflow while the building's maintenance supervisor, a heavy-set man named Gerald, who smelled permanently of onions and cigarettes, stood in the doorway making comments about how she should move faster. She hadn't responded. She never responded anymore. Responding cost energy she didn't have. Her ribs ached, not the dull background ache she'd learned to live with over the past 8 weeks. This was sharper, specific, a hot pulse on the left side every time she took a breath deeper than necessary. She'd wrapped them herself that morning with an ace bandage from the pharmacy on 3rd, and she'd done it tight enough to work, but not so tight that it showed through her uniform shirt. She was good at concealment by now. She'd had to become good at it. The rain intensified as she made the turn onto 54th, and she pulled her jacket tighter across her chest with one arm, the other holding the strap of her canvas work bag. The bag was heavy with her street clothes. She changed at the building, always, so nobody in her neighborhood ever saw her in the gray uniform with the Clearview Cleaning Services logo patch on the shoulder. Small dignity. She held on to every small dignity she could find. She was 2 blocks from the subway entrance when she heard the car. It didn't announce itself the way most cars did in this weather. No horn, no accelerating engine cutting through the rain. It simply materialized at the curb beside her, a black sedan so clean and dark it looked like a piece of the night that had taken on solid form. She kept walking. She'd learned not to react to black cars. In the world she'd accidentally stumbled into, black cars meant nothing good. But then the window came down. Miss Vale. Her name. He knew her name. She stopped walking. The rain drummed against her jacket and ran down her neck, and she stood there on the sidewalk at 11:47 at night, calculating the distance to the subway entrance, calculating whether she could reach it before whoever was in that car could reach her, calculating whether it mattered, whether anything she did in this particular moment would make any difference at all to whoever had sent this car, whoever had watched her closely enough to know her route, her name, her exact time of departure from the building. She turned. The man who got out of the back seat was not what she expected. She had braced herself for one of the Marchetti men, thick-necked and cologne-soaked and always smiling in that way that had nothing to do with warmth. She'd dealt with enough of them to know their texture, but this man was different in every register. He was tall, genuinely tall, not the inflated posture of a man trying to project authority, and he wore a dark coat that the rain seemed not to dare touch. His face was angular, the kind of face that looked like it had been assembled with purpose rather than chance. Strong jaw, and deep-set dark eyes, and a mouth that gave nothing away. He was maybe 40, maybe slightly older, and he stood at the edge of the sidewalk with the stillness of someone who had never once in his life needed to rush to get somewhere. He looked at her like he had all the time in the world. "You don't know who I am," he said. It wasn't a question. Sienna kept her hands loose at her sides. Her heart was doing something violent inside her chest, but she had gotten extremely good at making sure that nothing reached her face. "Should I?" Something moved in his expression. Not quite amusement, more like recognition. "My name is Lucien Devereaux." She knew the name. You couldn't spend 6 months orbiting the edges of organized crime in New York without hearing Lucien Devereaux's name at least 100 times. But she'd never connected it to a face. He didn't have a face, not publicly, not in the way that other men in his world had faces. He existed in those circles as a kind of gravity, something you felt the pull of without ever seeing the source directly. She didn't let herself react to the name. "What do you want?" "To talk. It's almost midnight. I'm going home." "I know." He said it simply, without threat. "I also know you transferred your brother's $38,000 debt to the Marchetti Syndicate 14 months ago when he couldn't pay, and that for the past 6 months, you've been working 3 jobs trying to service that debt, while a man named Carmine Russo makes sure you understand exactly what happens if you fall behind." The rain seemed to get louder, or maybe everything else got quieter. Sienna stood very still on the wet sidewalk and looked at this man who had just laid out the entire shape of the last 14 months of her life, as if reading from a menu. "How do you know that?" she said. Her voice came out flatter than she intended. "Because I make it my business to know what happens in this city." He took one step toward her, just one, measured, not threatening. "Who hit you, Miss Vale?" She felt her jaw tighten. "Nobody hit me." "You're favoring your left side. You've been doing it for at least 3 weeks. You adjusted how you carry your bag." His eyes moved to the canvas strap on her shoulder and back to her face. "Someone broke your ribs." "I fell." "You didn't fall." The flatness in his voice wasn't cruelty. It was the opposite of cruelty, she realized. It was someone who had looked at a lie and refused to pretend it was truth. And there was something about that, about being seen that plainly, that made her throat close in a way she hadn't anticipated. She swallowed it. She was good at swallowing things. "I don't know what you want from me," she said. "But whatever it is, I can't help you. I don't want anything from you." He said it cleanly, without elaboration. "Then why are we having this conversation in the rain?" He looked at her for a moment. The sedan idled behind him, and his driver stayed inside, and the rain came down between them, and he said, "Because I want to know his name." "Whose name?" "The man who put his hands on you." Sienna stared at him. There was something happening in her chest that wasn't fear, or wasn't only fear, and she didn't know what to do with it, so she defaulted to what she always defaulted to, which was pragmatism. "And if I tell you, what then? You do something about it, and Russo comes back harder, or the syndicate sends someone else, or my brother pays for it. I've run this math before. It doesn't come out well." "The math has changed." "I don't know what that means." "It means I'm involved now." He said it the way someone might say the weather had changed. Factual. Irreversible. "Which means the calculation is different, is..." She looked at him. Really looked at him. And tried to find the angle, the play, the thing he wanted from her that he was wrapping in the appearance of something else. She'd learned to look for angles. She'd learned that men who offered things without obvious price tags always had price tags. They were just hidden in places you couldn't see yet. She couldn't find it, and that scared her more than the Marchetti men ever had. "I don't know you," she said. "No, you don't." "I have no reason to trust you." "No, you don't." "So why would I tell you anything?" He was quiet for a moment, then, "Because you're standing in the rain with broken ribs at midnight on your way home from your 3rd job this week, and whatever you've been doing for the past 6 months clearly isn't working, and because..." He stopped. Something shifted in his expression. The first time she'd seen his composure change, just slightly. "Because nobody put their hands on you and walked away clean, not while I was watching." The silence stretched between them and the rain filled it. "Watching?" she said. "What does that mean?" He didn't answer immediately. He looked at her with those steady dark eyes, and then he said simply, "My office is on the 40th floor of Hargrove Tower, northeast corner." Sienna thought about that. She thought about her morning route. Lexington, up to 54th, through the plaza, past the building's main entrance where the coffee cart set up around 6:15, past the revolving door and the marble steps. The 40th floor. Northeast corner. She'd walked past that building every morning for 6 months. Something cold moved through her that had nothing to do with the rain. "You've seen me," she said slowly, "every morning." There was no apology in it and no shame, just fact. For 6 months. She didn't know what to do with that. She filed it somewhere she couldn't look at right now. There was too much of it, too much implication compressed into those words. And she brought herself back to the immediate problem, which was that she was standing in the rain across from the most powerful criminal in New York, and she had approximately 3 viable choices: run, cooperate, or tell him absolutely nothing and hope he let her walk away. Running seemed stupid. She'd worked in the city long enough to understand that if Lucien Devereaux wanted to find her tomorrow, he would find her. Telling him nothing meant the next 6 months looked like the last 6 months, which was not a thing she could survive. She made her decision. She made it the way she made all her decisions now. Fast, practical, without sentimentality. "His name is Carmine Russo," she said. "He's mid-level, Marchetti family, East Side operation. He's the one who manages the debt accounts." She kept her voice even. "It was 3 weeks ago. I was short on a payment because my second job cut my hours without warning, and I tried to explain that I'd make it up the following week. He didn't want to hear it." Lucien's face was very still. "He's broken them before?" he said, and the quietness of his voice was the most frightening thing she had heard all night. "My arm, 8 months ago. He said it was a warning." She looked at Lucien steadily. "The ribs were because I talked back." Something happened in Lucien Devereaux's eyes then, something dark and absolute that passed across them like weather. And then it was gone, and his face was still again, and he said, "Get in the car." "No." "Miss Vale, I'm not getting in your car. I don't know you. You've just told me you've been watching me for 6 months without my knowledge, and now you want me to get in your car at midnight." She held his gaze. "Give me one reason that sounds like anything other than trading one bad situation for another." He absorbed that. Then he said, "Because your brother is currently being held in a warehouse on the Queens waterfront, and he has been there for the past 4 hours. The bottom dropped out of her chest. "What?" The word came out wrong, too small. "His name is Danny, Daniel Vale, 24 years old. He went to the Marchetti men 2 days ago and told them he wanted out of the debt arrangement and that he was going to go to the police if they didn't release his sister." Lucien watched her face carefully. "They took that badly." "Danny?" She couldn't breathe. The ace bandage suddenly felt like a tourniquet. "How do you... is he... He's alive." Firm, immediate. "He's not well, but he's alive." "How do you know that?" "Because I have people watching that warehouse." He took another step toward her, and this time she didn't step back. "Miss Vale, I am not going to hurt you. I am not going to trade you to anyone. What I am going to do is take you somewhere safe and send my men to bring your brother out of that warehouse tonight." He looked at her, and for the first time she saw something in his expression that wasn't calculation, or that wasn't only calculation. "That is what I'm going to do. I am asking you to let me." Sienna stood in the rain and thought about Danny. Danny, who was 24 and stupid and had a mouth that ran faster than his brain, and who had gotten himself into this mess because he'd been trying to impress people who weren't worth impressing, and who had apparently, tried to fix it the only way he could think of, which was the way that involved going directly at people who could put him in a warehouse on the waterfront. 24 and stupid and still alive, according to this man. She looked at Lucien Devereaux and she thought, "This is not a good decision. This might be the worst decision you have ever made." She thought, "You are getting in the car." "If something happens to my brother, she started. "It won't." "You don't know that." "No," he agreed, "but I will do everything in my power to make sure it doesn't, and my power is considerable." He said the last part without arrogance, just honesty, the same way he'd said everything else. "That is all I can offer you." She looked at him for one more long moment. Then she picked up her canvas bag and walked to the car. The estate was north of the city. She couldn't have said exactly where. She'd spent most of the drive staring at her hands and trying not to think about the warehouse, and it was not what she'd expected. She'd built a picture in her head during the drive, something ostentatious, marble and chrome, the architectural equivalent of a man who needed you to know he had money. What she found instead was a stone house that had been standing for at least a century, surrounded by old trees that had survived every storm the Hudson Valley had thrown at them. It was large, but not absurd. It looked like a place where people actually lived. She didn't have time to look at it properly because the moment the car stopped, Lucien was already on his phone, speaking in a low voice to someone she couldn't hear on the other end, and then he was walking her inside, and a woman named Rosa, 50s, unsmiling, clearly not afraid of the man who employed her, was taking Sienna's wet jacket and saying something about a room being prepared, and Sienna was standing in an entrance hallway that smelled of old wood and something clean she couldn't identify, and she had no idea what she was doing here. Lucien ended his call. "My men are moving on the warehouse now. I'll have an update within the hour." "Can I talk to him when they get him out?" "Yes." She nodded. She was shaking slightly, and she hated that she was shaking. "Where am I sleeping?" "Rosa will show you." He paused. "Your ribs should be looked at properly. I can have a doctor here and—" "I'm fine." He looked at her with that expression that wasn't quite patience, but was something adjacent to it. "The ace bandage isn't sufficient for broken ribs. I've been managing." "I can see that." Something in his voice, not quite gentle, nothing about him was quite gentle, but quieter than the rest of what he'd said. "You've been managing everything yourself for a long time." She didn't respond to that. She couldn't respond to that because if she started thinking about how long she'd been managing everything herself, she would be standing in this entrance hallway for a while. "I'll see the doctor," she said, "after you tell me Danny is out." "Fair." Rosa appeared and Sienna followed her upstairs, and the room was clean and warm and had a bed that looked nothing like the cot in her apartment in Woodside. And she sat on the edge of it and listened to the rain against the windows and told herself she was going to be calm about this. She was going to be practical. She was going to treat this like the temporary situation it was, get Danny clear, and then figure out the rest. She was not going to think about the 40th floor, northeast corner. She failed at that immediately. 6 months. Every morning she'd walked past Hargrove Tower. She could see it clearly now, the broad glass face of it, the way it caught the morning light. And she'd been visible to him, a figure on the sidewalk below, and he'd apparently paid enough attention to know her route, her schedule, which days she carried the coffee from the cart and which days she didn't, the way she walked when she was in pain versus the way she walked normally. She didn't have a clean word for what that was. It was unsettling, and it was something else. Something she couldn't name yet, and she wasn't ready to name it. Her phone buzzed. It was a number she didn't recognize. She answered. "Sienna." A voice she hadn't heard in 3 weeks, rough and hoarse and so achingly familiar she felt something break loose in her chest. "Sienna, these guys say you're the one who—" "Danny." She pressed her hand to her mouth for a second. "Danny, are you okay? Are you—" "Yeah." A rough exhale. "Yeah, They roughed me up a little. I'm okay." "Sienna, who are these people? They say they work for—" "I know." She swallowed. "I'll explain everything. Are you with them now? Are you safe?" "I think so." A pause. "There were 4 Marchetti guys, Sienna. These guys took them apart like they were nothing." His voice was bewildered, the voice of someone who had just watched the world rearrange itself around him without warning, like they weren't even trying. She closed her eyes. "Okay. They're bringing you here. Just stay with them. Don't argue with them." You're okay?" "I'm okay." A lie of omission. Her ribs burned. "I'll see you soon." She hung up and sat in the quiet room, and the rain kept going, and somewhere below her in that stone house, Lucien Devereaux was making more calls, moving more pieces, dismantling in a single night something that had taken the Marchetti syndicate years to build. She thought, what does this cost? Because nothing came free. She knew that better than almost anyone. Every rescue had a price, every hand extended in the dark had a reason attached to it, and the reason wasn't always visible at the beginning. She had to know what this cost before she was in too deep to see the edges of it. Lucien was in his study when Rosa came to tell him the woman wanted to speak with him. He'd expected that. He'd expected it sooner, if anything. It spoke to how tired she was that it had taken her 40 minutes. He told Rosa to send her in and stood up from his desk. She came in without knocking, which he noted. She stood in the doorway of the study in a dry shirt she'd borrowed from somewhere, Rosa's probably, slightly too large, and her dark hair was loose around her face, and she looked at him with eyes that missed nothing. "I want to know what this costs," she said. No preamble. He gestured to the chair across from his desk. She didn't take it. "All right," he said. He remained standing. "Ask me directly. You brought me here. You're pulling Danny out of that warehouse. You're going after the syndicate." She stopped. "That's a lot. That's a lot of resources and risk and favor spending, and I want to know what I'm supposed to be giving you in exchange for it." He looked at her. He'd thought about how to answer this question for approximately 6 months, in the abstract, in the small margins of his mornings when he watched her walk across the plaza and thought about what he would say if he ever actually spoke to her. The honest answer was complicated. The honest answer required him to explain things about himself that he didn't usually explain to anyone. He decided she'd earned the honest answer. "Nothing," he said. "You're not giving me anything in exchange." "That's not how this works." "Not in the world you've been operating in? No." He looked at her steadily. "But this isn't the Marchetti Syndicate. You're still a criminal." "Yes." "So why would your version of this be different?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Because I watched you walk past my building every morning for 6 months. I watched you stop to move a hurt pigeon off the sidewalk so it didn't get stepped on. I watched you give the last of your coffee to a maintenance worker who looked cold. I watched you—" He stopped himself. "I watched a person who was clearly carrying something very heavy continue to treat the world around her with more consideration than it was treating her." Sienna stared at him. The room was very quiet. "And that's enough?" she said. "To go to war with the syndicate?" "The syndicate violated my territory without permission. That's the official reason, if you need one." His jaw tightened slightly. "But the reason I moved tonight and not some other night is what you told me on the sidewalk. What Russo did to you, what he did before." He met her eyes. "That's the reason." She looked at him for a long time. "I don't know what to do with that," she said finally. "You don't have to do anything with it. I'm not asking for—" He chose the word carefully. "I'm not asking for anything from you, Miss Vale. I told you that in the car, and I'm telling you again. You can stay here until we've confirmed the syndicate has been neutralized. Then you can leave. I'll make sure you're set up somewhere they can't reach you, and Danny's debt will be gone." "Gone how?" "Erased. Done. It won't exist anymore." She absorbed this. "And if I want to leave tomorrow, tonight, then you leave tonight. I'll take you wherever you want to go." She searched his face, and he let her search it. He wasn't a man who let many people look at him that directly, but he understood that she needed to see as much as she could see, that this was a woman who had learned the hard way to read people accurately and quickly, and he was not going to make that harder than it needed to be. "Why do you know my morning routine?" she said. "The coffee, the pigeon, the maintenance worker. You noticed all of that specifically." He said nothing. "You've been watching me," she said, "since before any of this, before the syndicate, before the debt. You knew who I was before tonight." "Yes." "Why?" A long pause, long enough that she straightened slightly, reading the pause the way she read everything. "Because the first morning I saw you, you stopped in the middle of the plaza in 30-degree weather to spend 5 minutes moving that pigeon somewhere safe," he said. "And then you bought coffee with what I later found out was literally your last $4 for the day and gave half of it to a man you'd never met who looked cold." He kept his voice level. "And I thought—" He stopped. "I thought I hadn't seen someone do something like that in a very long time." The silence that followed was the heaviest thing in the room. Sienna looked at the floor and then back at him. And there was something in her face that she was working very hard to contain, and he understood that he had given her too much at once. He had meant to hold some of this back, meter it out more carefully, but she had asked him directly, and he had told her the truth, and now they were both standing in his study at 1 in the morning with more honesty between them than either of them had anticipated. "I need to sleep," she said. "Of course." She turned toward the door. Then she stopped, her hand on the frame, not looking back at him. "Carmine Russo," she said. "He has a tattoo on his left forearm, a red cross with a dagger through it, in case your people need to make sure they have the right man." She left. Lucian stood in the study for a moment after she was gone, and then he picked up his phone and made a call. "The name is Carmine Russo," he said when the line connected. I want him found tonight." She didn't sleep well. That was no surprise. She never slept well anymore. Hadn't since the first time Russo's people had shown up at the apartment in Woodside and explained the terms of Danny's debt with the kind of clarity that left no room for misunderstanding. But this was a different kind of sleeplessness. Her body was exhausted in the particular way it got when adrenaline had been burning for too long, and her ribs ached despite the position she'd found on the unfamiliar bed, and her mind kept returning to the same place it kept insisting on going no matter how many times she redirected it. The 40th floor. Northeast corner. Every morning. She thought about what it meant that he'd noticed those specific things. The pigeon, the coffee, the maintenance worker. Those were small moments. Forgettable moments. She'd done all of those things automatically, reflexively, without thinking about them, because that was just how she moved through the world. She didn't think of herself as a particularly good person. She thought of herself as someone who was very tired and trying not to make other people's lives harder than they already were. But he had seen them, and he had remembered them, and apparently he had gone on remembering them for 6 months until the night he'd decided to step out of a black car into the rain. She didn't know what to do with a man like that. She didn't have a category for it. Danny arrived at 4 in the morning. She heard the car on the gravel below and was out of the room before she consciously decided to move, down the stairs and through the entrance hallway and out the front door into the cold air. And Danny was coming up the front steps being supported by one of Lucien's men, a large, quiet man who stepped back immediately when he saw Sienna moving toward them. Danny looked terrible. He had a split lip and one eye that was swelling shut and bruising along his jaw that would be spectacular by morning. He also had the expression he always wore when he knew he'd done something catastrophically stupid, a particular combination of sheepishness and defiance that she had known since he was 11 years old. She grabbed him by the front of his jacket. "You idiot," she said. Her voice was completely flat. "I know." He winced as the movement pulled something. "You went to them. You told them you were going to the police." You couldn't just. She stopped. She took a breath. She was going to start crying if she didn't stop herself, and she refused to cry on the front steps of Lucien Devereaux's estate at 4 in the morning. She pulled Danny into her very carefully because of her ribs and held on, and he held on back, and neither of them said anything for a moment. "I'm sorry," Danny said into her shoulder. "I'm sorry, Sienna. I was trying to—" "I know what you were trying to do. They were hurting you because of me. I know. I couldn't—" "I know, Danny." She let go of him. She looked at his face. "How bad?" "Nothing broken." He touched his jaw gingerly. "They were making a point. They weren't trying to— They were going to do worse later." He looked past her at the house. "Who are these people?" "I'll explain inside." She got him in and Rosa materialized. She seemed to materialize a lot, efficiently and without fuss, with a first aid kit and the particular expression of a woman who had cleaned up after men in trouble enough times to have feelings about it, but had chosen professionalism over commentary. She got Danny settled at the kitchen table, and Sienna sat across from him and explained as briefly and clearly as she could what had happened. Danny listened. He was quiet through most of it, which was unusual for him, which meant he understood the gravity. "Devereaux," he said, when she finished. "Lucien Devereaux." "Yes." "Sienna." He looked at her carefully. "You know who that is?" "Yes." "And you got in his car." "I got in his car." Because you were in a warehouse and I was out of options." She held his gaze. "I made a pragmatic decision." He looked at her for a long moment. "Is that all it was?" She looked back at him steadily. "Get your face cleaned up." In the morning, gray and quiet after the night's rain, she woke to find that the Marchetti operation on the east side had ceased to exist. She found this out from Danny, who had apparently been awake since 6 and had spent 2 hours talking with one of Lucien's men in the kitchen. A quiet, slightly dangerous-looking man named Marco, who seemed to feel that supplying Danny with breakfast and a detailed account of the night's events were equally part of his job. The syndicate's warehouse had been secured. Their financial records had been seized. Carmine Russo had been found in his apartment in Bensonhurst at 2 in the morning, and whatever had happened to Carmine Russo after that was not something Marco supplied details about. And Sienna decided that was fine, that there were things she didn't need to know the specifics of, that she was going to file this under the category of consequences and leave it there. She found Lucien on the stone terrace at the back of the house, standing with coffee, looking out at the trees. The grounds were long and deep and backed up against a ridge line, and everything was dripping and washed clean from the rain, and the morning light came through the clouds in long, flat strips. He heard her and turned. "Your brother?" he said. "Annoying, loud, eating everything in your kitchen. So roughly normal." She stopped a few feet from him. "The syndicate?" "Neutralized." "All of it?" "The East Side operation, yes. The financial structure, the physical assets, the personnel." He looked at her. "It's done." She absorbed that. "Russo. He won't hurt anyone else." She didn't ask for more than that. She stood beside him on the terrace and looked at the dripping trees and the gray morning sky and thought about the past 6 months. Every morning with the AC bandage, every shift she'd calculated against what she owed, every time she'd told herself to just get through this week, just get through this week, one more week. And something in her chest that had been clenched for a very long time began, very slowly, to loosen. "What happens now?" she said. "That depends on you." He looked at her. "You can leave today. I'll arrange an apartment. Danny's debt is gone. You have a clean start." A pause. "Or you can stay." "For how long?" "For as long as you want." He said it simply. "There's no obligation attached to it." She looked at him sideways. He was watching the trees with the same still attention he'd turned on everything else, and she thought, not for the first time, this is not a safe man. He is probably not a good man, not in any straightforward definition of that word. He runs an empire built on fear and leverage and the willingness to do things that the world pretends nobody does. And yet he had watched her move a hurt pigeon off a sidewalk and found it worth remembering for 6 months. "I want to know something," she said. "Ask." "The debt. You said you'd originally planned to erase it anonymously." He was quiet for a moment. "Yes?" "Before last night, before any of this." "Yes." "When were you going to do it?" He looked at the trees. "Soon," he said. "I'd been preparing the approach for several weeks." "Why didn't you do it earlier?" A long pause. "Because I was trying to find a way to do it, without you ever knowing I existed," he said. "I wanted you free of it, without you having any reason to feel like you owed me anything." He glanced at her. "And because I didn't know how to—" He stopped. "I'm not accustomed to not knowing how to approach a situation." Sienna looked at him for a long moment. "You were nervous," she said. Something in his expression shifted, not quite discomfort, but adjacent to it. "I wouldn't use that word." "What word would you use?" He said nothing, which was, she thought, its own kind of answer. She looked back at the trees. The morning was getting lighter, the clouds moving, a strip of actual blue appearing at the far edge of the sky. "I'll stay for a few days," she said finally, "until I know what comes next." He nodded. He didn't push it further. He just nodded and stood there beside her in the gray morning light, and the silence between them was not comfortable, not yet. It was too new and too strange for comfort, but it was something. It was the first silence she'd stood inside in 6 months that didn't have threat underneath it. She was almost afraid to trust it. That night, after Danny had gone to sleep and Rosa had locked up, and the house was quiet, Sienna sat in the study where Lucien had given her access to a phone and the internet, and she started looking through the financial records his men had seized from the syndicate. She wasn't entirely sure why. Professional habit, maybe. She'd worked in accounting before her life had contracted into survival mode, and the trained part of her brain wanted to understand the structure of what she'd been trapped inside. She had been working for 45 minutes when she found something that stopped her cold. The Marchetti syndicate had not been operating independently. Buried in the account structures, layered, obfuscated, but not obfuscated enough, was a pattern of transfers she recognized. She'd seen structures like this before, in another context, a long time ago, and she knew exactly what she was looking at. The syndicate had a partner, a senior partner, someone who had been feeding them resources and protection for years, someone powerful enough to have stayed invisible through multiple investigations. She sat very still in the study and looked at the numbers and thought, does Lucien know this? And then, does it change things if he does? And then, does it change things if he doesn't? If she saved the files, she copied them 3 times to 3 different locations. And then she sat there in the quiet study and thought about the past 6 months and the next 6 months and the way the calculations kept changing around her. And she thought about Lucien Devereaux standing on the terrace that morning with his coffee and his careful words and his 6 months of early morning observation. She thought, this is not over. She thought, it has barely started. Okay. 3 days later, Danny came to find her in the library. She'd discovered the library on her second morning and had been spending time there when she wasn't in the study or helping Rosa with things Rosa didn't need help with but politely accepted. And he had an expression on his face she recognized. He sat down across from her and looked at her with the particular quality of attention he reserved for things that mattered. "You're not leaving in a few days," he said. "I don't know yet. Sienna. Danny. Are you okay?" He said it carefully. "I mean, actually okay. Not the thing you say when I ask, so I don't worry." She looked at her brother, his healing face, his 24-year-old eyes that had seen too much in the past year and not enough of the right things, and she thought about the honest answer. "I don't know," she said. "I think I might be, eventually. I think—" She stopped. "I think something is different. I don't know what it is yet." Danny looked at her for a long moment. "He looks at you like you're the only thing in the room," he said. "Every time. I've noticed." "Danny, I'm just saying." He stood up. "I'm just saying, I've noticed." He left. She sat in the library and stared at the page she wasn't reading and thought about Lucien on the terrace. The way he'd said, "For as long as you want, no obligation attached." She thought about the files she'd copied, the senior partner buried in the accounts, the thing that wasn't over. She thought, there are things he needs to know. Things she had found, things that would change the shape of what he thought he'd finished last week. She thought, she was going to have to tell him, and she thought, before she could stop herself, before she could file it away somewhere more practical, that she didn't entirely hate the idea of having a reason to keep talking to him. She closed the book she wasn't reading and stood up. Outside the library window, the sky had finally cleared, and the afternoon light came across the Hudson Valley in long, clean lines. And somewhere in the house, Lucien Devereaux was doing whatever men like him did when they thought the crisis was over. He didn't know yet that it wasn't. She went to find him. She found him in the east wing of the house, in a room she hadn't seen yet. Not the study, not the main sitting room, but a narrower space behind it that served as something between a war room and an office, with a long table covered in documents and 2 of his men standing on opposite sides of it. The quiet one, Marco, and another she'd been told was named Fen, shorter, younger, with the kind of stillness that read less as calm and more as compressed energy waiting for direction. Lucien looked up when she came in. The 2 men looked at her and then at Lucien, and he said, "Give us a minute," and they left without comment. She noted that. She noted the way it happened without friction, without the shuffling reassertion of territory she'd seen with the Marchetti men every time a hierarchy needed to be performed. These men simply moved when asked. That said something about the man doing the asking. She put the printed pages on the table in front of him. She'd printed them in the study, 3 copies of the most relevant account structures, the ones that showed the pattern most clearly. "Look at these," she said. He looked at her first, then at the pages. He picked up the top sheet and she watched his eyes move across it. Not skimming, actually reading, which she'd expected of him by now. She'd already learned that he processed information the way he did everything else, completely and without performance. He was quiet for a moment. "Where did you find this?" he said. "In the files your men pulled from the syndicate's warehouse. The financial records." She pointed to a line near the bottom of the second page. "These transfers, the account structure here, this isn't Marchetti money. The origin point is buried under 4 layers of shell companies, but the pattern is consistent. Regular intervals, specific amounts, always routed through the same intermediate before it disappears." She looked at him. Someone was bankrolling them, for years. Someone who was careful enough to stay invisible through at least 2 federal investigations. He set the page down. He was very still. You know accounting, he said. I have a degree. She stopped. Before things changed, I worked for a mid-sized firm in Midtown. Corporate forensics mostly. Finding where money went that wasn't supposed to go anywhere. She looked at the pages. I recognized the architecture. Whoever built this knew what they were doing, but they got lazy toward the end, or confident. The structure in the last 8 months is sloppier than the earlier years, like they stopped worrying about being found. Lucien looked at her with an expression she was starting to be able to read, which was the expression he wore when something had shifted in his calculation and he was absorbing the shift. Do you know who it is? He said. Not yet. I have a partial routing trail and a set of transaction signatures, but I'd need access to more data to close the identification. She met his eyes. Do you? A long pause. Long enough. You do, she said. He picked up the page again. He looked at it for another moment, and then he set it back down and moved to the window and stood with his back to her, looking out at the yard where the afternoon light was starting to angle toward evening. His name is Vittorio Caruso, Lucien said. She waited. He controls 6 of the 12 major criminal organizations operating between New York and Philadelphia. He's been untouchable for 20 years because he doesn't get his hands dirty. He provides infrastructure, financing, legal cover, political connections, and he collects percentages. He turned from the window. The Marchetti Syndicate was one of his income streams. Is. His jaw tightened. My dismantling their operation last week removed one of his revenue sources without his authorization. That's a violation in his framework. You don't take apart another man's business without permission, regardless of the reason. Sienna processed this. He's going to respond. Yes. When? I don't know yet. Caruso moves slowly when he's angry. He's deliberate. He'll build a case first, make sure his position is defensible, then he'll move. Lucien looked at her steadily. I've been expecting contact for the past 2 days. She stared at him. You knew about Caruso before I walked in here. I knew the Marchetti family had a senior partner. I didn't know it was Caruso specifically. Something crossed his expression. Not quite discomfort, but honest. Your documentation confirms what I'd suspected. You suspected it, and you still moved on the syndicate last week. Yes. Knowing it would provoke someone like Caruso. Yes. She looked at him and felt something that wasn't quite anger. It was more precise than anger. It was the specific feeling of having made a decision based on incomplete information and realizing the information had been incomplete on purpose, not through deception exactly, but through omission, and omission from a man who had been very careful to present himself as someone who told her the full truth. You should have told me, she said. You were in shock. Your brother had just been pulled out of a warehouse and you had broken ribs, and that's not why. She kept her voice level. You didn't tell me because you didn't want it to change my decision. You didn't want me to know the full size of what I was stepping into. He didn't deny it. She stopped. She pressed 2 fingers against her temple for a second. That's the kind of thing that erodes trust, Lucien. She caught herself on the word, moved past it. If we're going to be in the same situation, I need the full picture. Always. Not the version you think I can handle. He was quiet. Then, you're right. It was so straightforward that it caught her off guard. No hedging, no defense, no explanation of his reasoning. Just, you're right. Okay, she said. Then tell me everything now. He told her. It took 90 minutes. She sat across from him at the long table and he walked her through the landscape of it. Caruso's network, the political connections, the names of the judges and the city officials, and the one federal prosecutor who had made a career out of prosecuting Caruso's rivals while finding investigative dead ends whenever Caruso's actual operations came into view. He told her about the code, the internal rules of the world he operated in, the ones that governed how disputes were resolved, how violations were handled, who had the authority to sanction what. He told her that destroying the Marchetti operation without Caruso's knowledge had broken the code, that Caruso would be within his rights, under that framework, to authorize sanctions against Lucien's organization. What does that mean in practice, she said. It means he could authorize other families to move against my business interests, freeze my accounts in certain institutions we both use. In extreme cases, authorize direct action against my people. Direct action. Yes, she sat with that. And the reason you moved anyway? Last week, knowing this might happen? He looked at her across the table. The evening light had shifted and the room was getting darker, and neither of them had moved to turn on a lamp. Because Russo broke your ribs, he said. And I was done waiting. The silence after that was very full. Sienna looked at the papers on the table and thought about 6 months in the 40th floor and the coffee she'd spent her last $4 on and the pigeon and all the small things that had apparently accumulated in a man's memory until they became the reason he went to war with an empire. She thought, this is too much. This is too much to be responsible for. She thought, you don't get to choose what other people make you mean to them. What's the play? She said. With Caruso. I'm working on it. That's not an answer. It's the honest answer. I'm still building the approach. He looked at her. I have leverage. I always have leverage. But Caruso is careful, and his position is technically correct under our framework. I violated the code. I need to either justify the violation on grounds he can't dismiss or find something that changes the political calculation enough that moving against me becomes more costly than accepting what I did. She looked at the account structures on the table. This documentation, she said slowly, his name connected to the syndicate's finances, the trafficking, the forced labor, the debt structures they were running, is the beginning of that calculation, yes. He was watching her. He's been funding an operation that was running a modern slavery system, she said, for years. If that becomes public, it ends him. Flat. Certain. But getting it to the right people, in the right way, without triggering a war first, that's the problem. Sienna looked at the pages. She thought about the women she'd never seen, the ones the Marchetti men had implied were in worse situations than hers, the ones she'd filed away as something she couldn't think about because she couldn't help them. And thinking about them while being unable to help was a specific kind of devastation she couldn't afford. I can rebuild this documentation trail, she said, properly, formatted for regulatory and federal review. I know how to build a financial evidence package. I've done it before, for legitimate corporate cases. She met his eyes. It would be clean, defensible, the kind of thing that survives legal challenge. He was very still. Sienna, I'm offering. I know you are. He stood up and moved away from the table, and she watched him, the way he put distance between himself and something that was pulling at him, which was the first time she'd seen him do that, the first time she'd seen him want something and deliberately step back from it. This isn't your fight. It became my fight when I spent 6 months being one of their assets. She held his gaze when he turned back. I know what they were doing. I know what the structure looked like from inside it. That's evidence too. You'd be a witness. Yes. That comes with exposure. It comes with risk. Most things I do come with risk. She kept her voice steady. The difference is this time I'd be choosing the risk for my own reasons instead of having it chosen for me. He looked at her for a long time. Danny, he said. Danny will be fine. Danny needs structure and a purpose, and I'll deal with Danny. She paused. Stop trying to find reasons to tell me no. I'm trying to find reasons to keep you safe. Those are two different things, and you know it. She stood up. I'm not one of your people, Lucy. And you don't manage me. If I decide to be involved in something, you can object, and I'll consider the objection, but the decision is mine. Something in his expression changed. Not softened exactly. It was more that something rigid in it eased, like a mechanism releasing tension it had been holding too long. All right, he said quietly. All right? Yes. He looked at her across the table, and the room was dark now except for the light coming from the hallway. I'll stop trying to find reasons to tell you no. Danny found out 3 days later. She'd been careful, or she thought she'd been careful, but Danny had always been better at reading her than she gave him credit for. He cornered her in the kitchen at 7 in the morning while Rosa was elsewhere and Marco was outside, and the house had the particular vulnerability of early morning, before everyone had put their armor back on. You're helping him, Danny said. Not a question. He was standing in the kitchen doorway with his arms crossed and his healing face set in the expression he got when he had already made up his mind about something and was waiting for confirmation before he started arguing. I'm working on the financial documentation. For what? For a case that could neutralize a very dangerous man and dismantle an operation that was running people the same way it was running us. She kept her voice even. It's the right thing to do. It's the thing that keeps you here. She looked at him. Danny, I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm saying I can see what's happening, and I want you to be honest with yourself about it. He unfolded his arms. You're staying for 2 reasons, and only one of them is the documentation. You don't know what you're talking about. I know you. He met her eyes. And I know that guy looked at you last night at dinner like you'd personally hung every light in the room and he was making sure he didn't stare. He paused. He's careful with you. I've watched him be careful with you in ways he isn't careful with anything else. Sienna was quiet. He's dangerous, she said finally. Yeah. His world is... It's not a world I belong in. Maybe not, but you're in it. Danny's voice was frank and not unkind. You've been in it since the night you got in his car. The question isn't whether you're in it. It's what you're going to do while you're there. She looked at her coffee cup. Outside the kitchen window, the grounds were silver with morning mist, and 2 of Lucian's men were moving through the far tree line on their regular perimeter check. And the whole thing was so entirely unlike anything she had imagined her life looking like that. She had no framework for it. He's not going to hurt me, she said. She said it quietly, almost not to Danny, almost just to hear herself say it. No, Danny agreed. I don't think he is. A pause. I think he'd set the whole city on fire before he let anything hurt you, which is its own kind of thing to think about. She didn't respond to that. She drank her coffee and Danny let it go because Danny could read the room when it mattered, and after a moment he went and made himself breakfast and the conversation was over. But she sat with it. She sat with it all morning. Mwah. Lucien's contact from Caruso came at noon. She was in the study when she heard the shift in the house's atmosphere. Not a sound exactly, more a quality change, the way a room feels different when something has entered it that wasn't there before. She heard Marco's voice from the front of the house, and then Lucien's, and then a third voice she didn't recognize, and she stayed where she was because she understood, without being told, that this was something she was not yet supposed to be part of. She was part of it 11 minutes later when Lucien came to the study door. His face was very controlled. She was learning to read what lived under his control, the particular set of his jaw when something had genuinely threatened him, the way his eyes went flat and focused. And she could see it now. Caruso's representative was here, he said. I heard. He's called a sit-down. The senior leadership of 6 families, a formal convening to address the violation. He looked at her. In 2 weeks. What happens at the sit-down? I answer for what I did. Present my justification. They vote on whether the violation is excused or whether sanctions are authorized. He came into the room and closed the door behind him. The problem is that most of those 6 family heads have some connection to Caruso's network. Their vote isn't going to be neutral. So the deck is stacked. Yes. She looked at him. Can you build enough of a counterposition before then? The documentation? Possibly. If we had... He stopped. His expression shifted. The documentation alone might not be enough. It's financial. It shows connection, funding. But Caruso will argue he didn't know the specifics of what the Marchetti men were doing with the money. Plausible deniability. He's very good at it, she thought. What would remove the deniability? Testimony from someone inside the operation. Someone who had direct interaction with both the syndicate's practices and the upstream funding. He looked at her carefully. Someone who was in the system. The room was quiet. Me? She said. Sienna, I'm not asking, I'm clarifying. She stood up from the desk. I was in their system. I know how the debt servicing worked. I know the collection protocols, the enforcement structure, the way they categorized workers. I interacted with their accounting side when I was making payments. She looked at him. I'm a direct witness to their practices. I can speak to the connection between the debt operation and the violence used to maintain it. If you testify at a sit-down of 6 major criminal organizations, then I'd better make sure my testimony is good enough that they can't dismiss it. She met his eyes. I'm not fragile, Lucien. I've been the least powerful person in every room I've been in for 14 months. I know how to stand in a room where people would rather I wasn't there. He looked at her for a long moment. There was something moving through his expression that she was just starting to learn the name of, something that lived under his composure in the specific way that things live under ice, present, significant, pressing against the surface without breaking it. There's something else, he said. She waited. Caruso's representative implied, very carefully, with full deniability, that the sit-down would go more smoothly if I came without you. He said it flatly. That your presence would be seen as a complicating factor. That a man who went to war over a cleaning woman was either in love or out of control, and neither was a good look in that room. The word went through her like a current. And are you, she said, one of those things? The silence was very long. I'm not out of control, Lucian said. She held his gaze. She held it for 3 full seconds, and he held hers back, and the thing under the ice pressed hard against the surface and didn't break through. And she looked away first because she had to, because if she kept looking at him like that in this room, she was going to say something she wasn't ready to say. I'm going to the sit-down, she said. That's not negotiable. I know. You're not going to talk me out of it. I know that too. He watched her. I stopped trying to find reasons to tell you no, remember? She remembered. She looked at the desk, at the financial documents she'd been rebuilding for the past 3 days, the clean, careful architecture of evidence she was constructing from the ruins of the system that had consumed 14 months of her life. She thought, 2 weeks. She thought, we have 2 weeks to build something strong enough to walk into a room full of men like Caruso and not get destroyed. She thought, I have been in worse positions. She thought, have you though? Have you actually? I need more data, she said. The transaction signatures I have go back 3 years. I need the full history. Can your people pull the earlier records from the warehouse seizure? Marco can have them to you by tonight. Then I'll need tonight and tomorrow. She sat back down and pulled the papers toward her. Can you make sure I'm not interrupted? He was quiet for a moment. Then, I'll have Rosa bring you dinner in here. Thank you. He moved to leave. She heard him reach the door. Lucien? He stopped. She didn't turn around. She looked at the documents in front of her and she said, the thing Caruso's man implied, that you went to war over a... She stopped, picked the words more carefully. That the reason you moved on the syndicate was personal. Yes. Is it going to be a problem? In that room? A pause. Only if I let it be. And will you? No. Certain. Immediate. In that room, you'll be the most important person present, not because of what you are to me, because of what you know and what you're willing to say. Another pause, shorter. But yes, it is personal. I'm not going to pretend otherwise to you. She sat with that. She sat with it the way you sit with something heavy, not putting it down, not lifting it higher, just holding it and feeling the weight. Okay, she said. She heard him leave. She turned back to the documents and worked. No. On the 6th day, 3 things happened that changed the shape of everything. The first was Marco coming to her at breakfast with a look on his face that was not quite alarm. Marco didn't do alarm, but was the nearest he apparently got to it, and telling her quietly that 2 of Lucien's business associates had received private communications overnight, the kind of communications that were designed to be warnings without being provable as threats. Someone was beginning to move the pieces. The second was Danny, who came to find her afterward and told her that he'd been on the phone with their mother, who lived in Providence and who Sienna had been carefully not telling the full truth to for 14 months, and that their mother had received a visit from a man asking questions about their family, about Sienna specifically, about where she was. Sienna was very still when Danny told her this. She asked for the description of the man and Danny gave it, and she didn't recognize it, which meant Caruso had more people than she'd mapped, which meant the perimeter was leaking in ways she hadn't accounted for. The third thing was the phone call. She took it in the study, on the secure line Lucian had set up, and the voice on the other end was a woman's. Low, careful, professional. Ms. Vale, the woman said. My name is Agent Sandra Reyes. I'm with the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. We've been building a case against the Marchetti Syndicate for 16 months. A pause. We know you were in their system. We've been looking for a way to reach you safely. Another pause, longer. We also know that you're currently with Lucien Devereaux. Sienna sat very still and said nothing. Ms. Vale, Reyes said, I need you to understand something. Whatever Mr. Devereaux has told you about the current situation, whatever arrangement you believe you have with him, you need to know that we have been watching his organization for 18 months. And 3 weeks ago, when he moved against the Marchetti Syndicate, he didn't just dismantle a criminal operation. The voice was careful, precise, the voice of someone choosing every word with full knowledge of its weight. He seized assets, financial records, evidence that connects several organizations to a federal investigation. A pause. Evidence that he now controls, evidence that other people, dangerous people, want back. Sienna's hand was very steady on the phone. Her pulse was not. Why are you telling me this? She said. Because you are currently inside his estate with documentation you built yourself, which means you understand the landscape better than most. And because in approximately 11 days, there is going to be a meeting of 6 criminal organizations, and if that meeting goes badly, Reyes stopped. You're a civilian, Ms. Vale. You have leverage you may not fully understand, and you're surrounded by people who will use that leverage without regard for what it costs you. Including you? Sienna said. Silence. Including me, Reyes said. Honest, at least. Yes. Sienna looked at the documents on the desk, the architecture she had built, the trail she had spent 6 days making clean and irrefutable. She thought about Lucien. She thought about the things he'd told her and the thing he'd withheld, and the way he'd said, "You're right," and the way he'd looked at her across the dark room. She thought about the 40th floor. She thought, everyone in this wants something from you. Everyone has a use for you. The question is whose use aligns with what you actually want. She thought, and what do you actually want? I'll need 24 hours, she said. Ms. Vale, 24 hours. Her voice was very calm. Then I'll call you back. She hung up. She sat in the study for a long time without moving. The afternoon light moved across the wall and she watched it, and she thought, and she did not go find Lucien immediately, because she needed to think first, alone, without his presence in the room affecting the way. She gave herself 2 hours. Not 24. She'd said 24 to Reyes because she needed the agent to believe she was considering it carefully, that she was a cautious woman weighing her options, that she wasn't going to do anything rash. 2 hours was what she actually needed. 2 hours to sit with everything she knew and everything she didn't know and map the distance between them as honestly as she could. The afternoon light finished its slow transit across the study wall, and the room went gray, and she didn't turn on the lamp. She thought about Reyes. The voice had been careful, but not cold. That specific professionalism of someone who had learned to hold a case at arm's length from their own feelings about it, and had not entirely succeeded. The hesitation before, including me. That hesitation was real. It was the sound of a person telling an uncomfortable truth they hadn't planned to tell. And it had cost Reyes something to say it, and Sienna had noticed the cost. She thought about what Reyes had actually said. Not the warning. The warning was generic, applicable to anyone in Sienna's position, but the specific information buried inside it. That the federal investigation had been running for 16 months, that they'd been looking for a way to reach her safely, that they knew she was here. They knew she was here, which meant Lucien's estate was not as sealed as she'd assumed, which meant someone was providing information about its inhabitants, which meant the perimeter she'd thought existed around this place was at minimum porous, and at maximum. She didn't finish that thought yet. She set it aside and moved to the next piece. The evidence. Reyes had said, evidence that he now controls, evidence that other people want back. She hadn't said, evidence that he's using against you. She hadn't implied Lucien was the threat. She'd said he controlled something valuable in a landscape full of people willing to harm others to retrieve it, and that Sienna was inside that landscape. That was different. She thought about the documentation she'd built. 6 days of work. The financial trail, the account structures, the transaction signatures. It lived on the secure drive Lucien had given her, and it lived in 3 other locations she'd established herself. And it lived in her head in the way that things you've built from nothing live in you. Thoroughly, structurally, in a way that can't be seized or deleted. She thought, Reyes doesn't know about the 3 other locations. She thought, Lucien doesn't know about them either. She thought, That was either very good planning or very good instinct, and either way, it was the one thing she had that belonged entirely to her. She got up. She went to find Lucien. He was in the east room again, this time alone, standing at the window with his back to the door, and when she came in, he turned and looked at her, and something in his face shifted immediately, the way it did when he registered that something had changed, that she was carrying something she hadn't been carrying the last time he'd seen her. "Sit down," she said. He sat. She remained standing. She needed the geography of it, needed to be the one on her feet. "A federal agent called me today," she said, "on the secure line." Not one muscle in his face moved. "Her name is Sandra Reyes, Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. She says they've been building a case against the Marchetti Syndicate for 16 months. She watched him. "She also says they've been surveilling your organization for 18 months. A pause. "That's accurate," he said. "You knew. I've known for approximately 14 months that there was federal interest in my operations, yes." His voice was very even. "It's not unusual. Organizations like mine attract periodic attention. The approach is to remain clean enough at the edges that the attention finds nothing actionable. She said you seized financial records when you dismantled the syndicate, records that are relevant to their federal investigation." She looked at him. "Records that dangerous people want back. Also accurate. You're holding federal evidence. I'm holding documents that are simultaneously relevant to a federal case and to my current conflict with Caruso." He met her eyes directly. "I was planning to tell you." "When?" "When I'd figured out the optimal use, how to leverage them against Caruso at the sit-down without triggering a federal response that would complicate—" He stopped. "That would complicate what?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. "That would complicate your position." She stared at him. "My position. If the federal case moves prematurely, you become a material witness in a federal proceeding before we've addressed Caruso. That makes you a target from two directions simultaneously: Caruso's people and anyone else who doesn't want that case to advance." He looked at her steadily. "I was trying to sequence it so you were protected before the federal piece activated." She absorbed this. She stood in the room and absorbed it and looked at his face, the careful construction of it, the absolute stillness, and tried to determine whether what she was looking at was a man who had been genuinely trying to protect her or a man who had been managing her, and whether those two things could be the same thing and still be a problem. "How long have you known about Reyes specifically?" she said. 3 days. 3 days. The words came out flat. "Yes. While I was in this room building documentation, while we were discussing the sit-down, while—" She stopped herself, took a breath. "You knew a federal agent was looking for a way to reach me, and you didn't tell me." "I was going to—" "When, Lucien?" The flatness cracked, just slightly, not into anger exactly, into something more precise. "When were you going to tell me?" "After the sit-down. After you'd used the evidence the way you needed to use it? After you'd sequenced everything to your satisfaction?" He said nothing. "I told you," she said. "I told you 3 days ago that I needed the full picture. Always. I told you that omission was the thing that erodes trust." She looked at him. "And then you sat across from me every day and let me build this case, and didn't mention that a federal agent was trying to reach me. I was protecting—" "Stop saying that." Her voice was quiet, quieter than it had been, which was worse than if she'd raised it. "Stop using that word as though it covers everything. I am not something that needs to be managed, Lucien. I am a person who needed information, and you chose not to give it to me." The room was very still. He stood up. Not aggressively. He moved slowly, deliberately, the way he always moved. And he stood up and he said, "You're right. There's no qualification. I should have told you. I told myself I was protecting you, and I was also managing the situation, and they're not the same thing, and I knew the difference, and I did it anyway." He held her gaze. "I'm sorry." She looked at him for a long moment. The apology was real. She'd learned to read him well enough to know when something was real, and it landed in her chest with the weight of something real. She didn't soften. Not yet. She couldn't afford to soften yet. "Reyes wants to meet," she said. "She wants to talk about my testimony, about using the documentation as part of the federal case." "I know." "If I cooperate with her, what happens to you?" He looked at her. "Depends on how the cooperation is structured. If it's targeted at Caruso's network, which is what she actually wants, I think, Caruso is the significant target, then my organization is a peripheral concern. She'd be offering me something in exchange for the evidence. Immunity. Partial. Limited scope. His jaw tightened. I don't particularly want it. Why not? Because accepting it means restructuring my operations in ways I'm not prepared to. He stopped. He looked at something past her shoulder and then back at her face. Because it changes what I am. What you are, she said slowly. What I've built. How it functions. He looked at her. I know how that sounds. It sounds like you've spent 20 years building something and you don't know who you are without it. He absorbed that. He absorbed it the way he absorbed things, completely, without defensive deflection. And he said, yes, that's probably accurate. She thought, there it is. The thing under everything else. The thing that lives beneath the power and the stillness and the 6 months of watching and the going to war over broken ribs. A man who has built himself so thoroughly into a structure that he can't see where the structure ends and he begins. She thought, that's familiar in ways I don't want to examine right now. I'm meeting with Reyes, she said. Tomorrow, whatever you're trying to sequence, the timeline has changed. She knows I'm here, which means others know I'm here, and waiting is starting to look more dangerous than moving. He nodded. I'll arrange it. I'll arrange it, she said. You can provide the security. But the meeting is mine. A pause. Then, all right. She left. What? She didn't sleep well again. Different reason this time. She lay in the dark room and stared at the ceiling and thought about the expression on his face when she'd said, you don't know who you are without it. The way something had shifted. Not broken, not collapsed, but genuinely moved. The way a heavy object moves when sufficient force is applied. Incrementally, undeniably. She thought about the fact that she'd been angry and had stayed angry and had not let the apology dissolve it immediately, and that he had not pushed her to let it dissolve, had not performed remorse or chased her down the hallway, had simply stood in the room and accepted the weight of it. She thought, that's not nothing. She thought, stop thinking about this and go to sleep. She did not go to sleep for a long time. Reyes arrived the next afternoon in an unmarked car with one other agent who stayed outside. She was mid-40s, compact, with the kind of face that had done a lot of controlled expression work over a long career, and showed the residue of it. Not hard exactly, but settled, like someone who had made their peace with the specific kind of ugly that her job required. She looked around the room Lucien had provided, a sitting room on the ground floor, neutral territory, 3 exits, and she sat down and looked at Sienna with assessment that was professional and not unkind. You're not what I expected, Reyes said. What did you expect? Someone more frightened. She said it plainly, without flattery. Most witnesses in your position? She stopped. You've had time to stabilize. That changes people. It does. Sienna sat across from her. You said you've been building a case for 16 months. Correct. What's the case? Reyes looked at her for a moment. Then she opened the folder she'd brought and laid a document on the table between them. Human trafficking, forced labor, wire fraud, racketeering. The syndicate was running a debt servicing system that functioned as modern slavery. She looked at Sienna. You were in it. Yes, and you have documentation of the financial structure. Yes. Ms. Vale. Reyes leaned forward slightly. I need you to understand the scope. The Marchetti operation was one node. We've traced the structure to at least 11 other debt operations running in 5 states. Approximately 400 people currently in conditions similar to yours. She paused. Caruso's network is the architecture that all of them run on. Sienna sat with that number. 400. She thought about her own 14 months. The weight of it, the specific texture of every morning she'd woken up and calculated and moved through it. And she multiplied it by 400 and sat very still. What do you need from me? She said. Your testimony, your documentation, and something else. Reyes looked at her carefully. We have a problem with the sit-down in 6 days. Sienna stilled further. You know about the sit-down, she said. We've known for 4 days. Reyes held her gaze. Ms. Vale. We have an informant inside Caruso's organization. Have had one for 8 months. A pause. That informant is the source of our information about your location, about the sit-down. Another pause, calibrated. About the documentation you've been building. Something cold moved through Sienna. Someone in this house. Someone adjacent to this house. Reyes watched her. We're not prepared to compromise the informant's identity. But I'm telling you this because it affects the security of your position, and you have a right to know that the information flow here is not contained the way you may have assumed. Sienna thought about Marco and Fen and Rosa and the two men on the perimeter and Danny. She dismissed Danny immediately, instinctively, and then made herself not dismiss him instinctively, made herself hold the possibility for 3 seconds before setting it aside, because she had learned not to exempt anyone based on feeling alone. Adjacent, she said, not inside the house itself. Correct. Someone in Lucien's organization, but not his inner circle. I'm not going to confirm or... Someone who has access to information about operations, but not about private conversations in this building. She looked at Reyes. Which means they know about the documentation because it became operationally relevant. Lucien's people would have discussed it in the context of the sit-down preparation. But they don't know what's in it specifically. They don't know what I found. Reyes was quiet for a moment. Something moved in her face. You're fast, she said. I've had a lot of practice reading incomplete information. Sienna looked at the document on the table. What's the problem with the sit-down? Reyes reached into the folder and produced another document. She placed it on the table, and for a moment Sienna looked at it without touching it, reading it from a distance, and then she picked it up because she had to pick it up, because she had to see it fully. It was a financial document. Familiar architecture. She had spent 6 days immersed in structures exactly like this one. Account transfers, shell company routing, intermediate nodes. The originating account was one she recognized from the Marchetti records. The receiving account, the final destination at the end of the chain, was not one she recognized, but the routing signature was. She had seen this exact signature in one other place in the past 6 days. She had noted it and filed it as an anomaly she hadn't yet explained and had meant to return to. She looked at the document and felt the floor move beneath her in the way floors move when something fundamental has changed, when the ground you've been standing on reveals itself to be something other than what you thought it was. Where did you get this? She said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of how steady it was. Our informant. Reyes watched her face carefully. Miss Vale, the receiving account, I can see what it is. She set the document down. She set it down very carefully, the way you set down something that might shatter. When does this start? The transfers. 14 months ago. 14 months. Exactly the length of Danny's debt. Exactly the window of the arrangement that had consumed her life. And the account holder, she said, though she had already looked at the name at the bottom of the document and she already knew. Lucien Devereaux, Reyes said. He was receiving a percentage of the Marchetti debt operation for the past 14 months, she paused, including the period during which you were in the system. The sitting room was completely silent. Sienna looked at the document. She looked at the name. She looked at the routing signature she had filed as an anomaly 6 days ago and had meant to return to and had not returned to because she had been building the case, building the clean, irrefutable architecture of evidence, working in the study he had provided in the house he had brought her to, and she had not returned to the anomaly because she had not wanted to find what she had just found. She had known, somewhere below the line of conscious thought, that there was something wrong with that routing signature. She had known it, and she had not looked at it, and she had told herself it was because she hadn't gotten to it yet, and she had believed that. She had actually believed that. She was very cold. How long have you had this? She said. 8 months. It's been part of the federal file. Reyes's voice was carefully neutral. I want to be precise about what it shows. The transfers stopped 5 weeks ago. The timing suggests he cut the arrangement when he decided to move on the syndicate, Sienna said. Her voice was very flat. Which means he had a financial reason to maintain the operation for 14 months and a different financial reason to dismantle it 5 weeks ago. She looked up at Reyes. And an additional reason that wasn't financial. Reyes said nothing. He was receiving money from the system that was running me, Sienna said. She said it carefully, like she was explaining something to herself. For 14 months, while he watched me from the 40th floor. The silence stretched. Ms. Vale, Reyes said quietly. Don't. Sienna stood up. She moved to the window and stood there with her back to the room and looked out at the grounds, at the old trees and the long grass, and the two men on the perimeter doing their regular rotation, and she breathed, deliberately, through her nose and out through her mouth, the way the doctor had shown her after Russo broke her arm, the way she'd learned to move oxygen through a body that wanted to stop cooperating. Her ribs ached. They had been aching less over the past week. She noticed that they ached now. She thought about every conversation. The rain, get in the car, the terrace, for as long as you want. I stopped trying to find reasons to tell you no. She thought about the anomaly she had not looked at, and she thought about why she had not looked at it, and she thought about Danny saying, "He looks at you like you're the only thing in the room." She thought, people can look at you like you're the only thing in the room while simultaneously running a system that treated you as a line item. She thought, I got in the car. I got in the car, and I came here, and I built him a case. She turned back to the room. The 3 copies of the documentation, she said. Her voice was completely steady now. The ones I stored outside this building. He doesn't know about them. Reyes looked at her carefully. No, I need them to stay that way. She looked at Reyes. And I need you to tell me exactly what testimony you need and what you're prepared to offer. Full scope, nothing withheld. Ms. Vale? Reyes leaned forward. What are you planning to do? Sienna looked at the document on the table, Lucien Devereaux's name, the routing signature she had recognized and not followed. She thought about the sit-down in 6 days, the room full of men like Caruso, the case she had built, clean, irrefutable, thorough, and what it was worth and who it served and what she wanted to do with it. She thought about walking into that room not as Lucien Devereaux's protected witness, not as the woman he'd gone to war for, the woman he'd brought to his estate, the woman he'd watched from the 40th floor. She thought about walking into that room as herself, with what she knew, with what she'd built, on her own terms. She thought, he told you he stopped trying to find reasons to say no. She thought, the question is whether you stop trying to find reasons to forgive him before you know if there's anything left worth forgiving. She looked at Reyes. I'm going to that sit-down, she said, but not the way anyone expects. The sit-down is a closed criminal proceeding. You can't just... I was invited, Sienna said, by Caruso's representative. They wanted Lucien to come without me, which means they know I exist, which means my presence is already on the table. She picked up the document with Lucien's name on it. She looked at it one more time. And now I have something nobody in that room is expecting me to have. She set it back down. Tell me about your offer, she said. And tell me how fast you can move if I give you everything in the next 5 days. Reyes looked at her for a long moment. Then she opened her folder again. Outside, through the window, Sienna could see the long driveway that led back to the main road. And beyond it, the tree line. And beyond that, the gray October sky pressing down on everything. And she stood in the room where she had sat across from a federal agent and learned that the man who had saved her life had also been profiting from the system that had nearly destroyed it. And she thought about the word betrayal, the specific texture of it, the way it felt different from fear or anger, the way it settled in the body, not as heat, but as a particular kind of cold. And she decided she was going to use it, not let it use her. There was a difference, and she had 5 days to make sure she remembered what it was. She sat back down across from Reyes and said, Start from the beginning. Everything you have. I want all of it. And her voice did not shake even once as she said it, which was the bravest thing she had done in 14 months. And no one in the room knew that except her. She had 5 days, and she used every hour of them. Reyes left that afternoon with a copy of the documentation and a timeline and a set of conditions Sienna had negotiated with the same focused precision she'd brought to every financial structure she'd ever rebuilt from ruins. Immunity for Danny. Full, unconditional, documented. A secured location for her mother in Providence for the duration of the proceeding. Witness protection consideration post-testimony at Sienna's discretion, meaning she could decline it, meaning she retained the choice. And one more condition that Reyes had looked at carefully before agreeing to, the one that had taken the longest to negotiate, the one that changed the shape of everything. She did not tell Lucien about the meeting. She went back inside and she moved through the house with the same steadiness she'd been maintaining since she'd set that document down on the table. And she worked in the study every evening and she ate dinner with him twice and she answered his questions about the documentation with answers that were technically accurate and selectively complete. And she hated doing it, hated it in a specific, visceral way that lived in her throat every time she looked at his face. But she did it, because she had made a calculation, and the calculation required it. She did not sleep much. She thought about confronting him directly. She ran that version forward in her mind, sitting down across from him, laying the document on the table, watching his face. And she couldn't predict how it ended. That was the problem. With most people, she'd learned to predict how things ended. With Lucien, she still couldn't, and that uncertainty had been interesting before she'd found his name on a Marchetti payment record, and was now something more dangerous than interesting. She thought about this possibility that he didn't know. She gave it genuine consideration. The structure of the transfers was layered enough that a man at Lucien's level, receiving periodic payments through 4 shell companies, might not have looked at the origin carefully, might have accepted it as a return on some investment he'd made years ago, the way men like him accumulated returns without always tracking their specific genealogy. She thought, that's possible. She thought, it's also the story you tell yourself when you want it to be true. She found the answer on day 3, buried in a document she'd missed the first time through because she'd been focused on the Caruso connections and had filed the earlier years of Marchetti records as background. It was a communication record, encrypted, but not encrypted well enough, between a Marchetti lieutenant named Ferraro and an account manager at one of the shell companies. Dated 22 months ago, referencing a meeting at which the profit-sharing arrangement had been discussed and agreed upon. The meeting had taken place in a building on the Upper East Side. The building was registered to a real estate holding company. The holding company was owned by Lucien Devereaux. She sat with that for a long time. She sat with it until it stopped feeling like the floor was moving and started feeling like solid ground, because solid ground, even terrible solid ground, was something she knew how to stand on. She added the communication record to the package she was building for Reyes. She did not look at Lucien at dinner that night. The night before the sit-down, he came to find her. She was in the study, as she always was, but she wasn't working. She was sitting in the chair by the window, looking at the dark grounds and the dark sky, and thinking about tomorrow, running the sequence forward over and over, checking for gaps. He came in without knocking, the first time he'd done that, and he stood in the middle of the room and looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen before on his face. Not controlled, not calculated, something rawer than that, something that had gotten out from under the management of it. Something's changed, he said. She looked at him. A lot of things have changed. We've been preparing for a significant event. With me. Something's changed with you and me. He didn't move from the center of the room. 3 days ago, you looked at me differently than you're looking at me right now. Her chest pulled tight. She kept her face still. I'm focused on tomorrow. Sienna. Lucien. Don't. He said it quietly, and it landed hard. Don't do the thing where you answer me with my own name. I've watched you do that to other people when you want to close a conversation. I'm not other people. She looked at him. She thought, no, you're not. She thought, you're the man who received 14 months of payments from a system that owned me. She thought, tell him. Tell him now. Get it done and get it out of the room before tomorrow, because you need to be clear tomorrow. You need every part of your attention tomorrow, and you can't have that if you're carrying this into that room unresolved. She said, are you familiar with a communication record between a Marchetti lieutenant named Ferraro and an account manager at a company called Del Rey Financial, dated 22 months ago? The stillness that came over him was different from his usual stillness. This was the stillness of impact, of something landing and the body registering the hit before the mind had caught up with it. He said nothing. The meeting it references, she said. Upper East Side? Real estate holding company? Yours. She held his gaze. The profit-sharing arrangement for the Marchetti debt operation. She paused. Were you going to tell me about that? The silence was enormous. Yes, he said. When? After the sit-down. After Caruso was neutralized and you were safe, and there was enough distance from the immediate threat that I'd already forgiven you for saving me? Her voice came out quieter than she intended, which was worse than if she'd shouted it. That I'd be far enough in that walking away would be harder? No. He said it hard. That's not... Then what? Help me understand the sequencing, Lucien. You knew for 5 days that I was in that system. You knew for 5 days and you were calculating when to tell me. How is that different from what you accused yourself of doing with Reyes? He crossed the room. Not fast. He never moved fast, but with a directness that brought him to within 3 feet of her and stopped there. I ended it, he said. The arrangement, 5 weeks before I ever got out of that car. I know, the transfers stopped, because I found out what they were running. His jaw was tight. I didn't know what the Marchetti operation was when I agreed to the arrangement. I was told it was a debt recovery business, standard collection. I took a percentage of returns on money they owed me, and I didn't look at the mechanics closely enough. He looked at her. That is not an excuse. I should have looked. I didn't look because it was convenient not to look, and that is something I have to own. She looked at him. She was looking for the performance, looking for the place where the contrition became managed, became strategic, became another version of the sequencing she'd caught him in twice now. She was looking for it very hard. She couldn't find it, which scared her more than finding it would have. I found out 8 weeks before the night I got out of that car, he said. I found out what they were actually running, who was in it, the debt structures, the enforcement. He paused. I found out you were in it. She felt something shift. What? I knew your name. I'd known it for months. I'd had you looked into after the first few weeks of watching you. I wanted to know you were safe. I needed to... He stopped. It doesn't matter why. I knew your name. And when I found out what the Marchetti operation actually was, I had my people cross-reference the worker accounts. His voice was very even, and she understood that the evenness was costing him something significant. Your name was in their system. She was very still. That's when you ended the arrangement, she said. That's when I ended the arrangement, yes. And started planning to erase Danny's debt, yes. And watched from the 40th floor every morning while you figured out how to approach me. Yes, she thought about that. She thought about what it meant. A man who had been part of a system that enslaved her, who had found out and stopped and spent 8 weeks trying to find a way to make it right before the night in the rain. And she thought about whether that arc, that specific moral arc, was enough, was the kind of thing that could be enough. And she didn't know. She genuinely did not know. I'm going to testify tomorrow, she said. I'm going to use everything I've built to dismantle Caruso in that room. And after tomorrow, I'm going to have to figure out what I think about all of this. She met his eyes. But right now I need you to hear me say, you should have told me, day one. The moment you decided I was someone worth protecting, you should have been honest about why protection was necessary, about your part in why it was necessary. He held her gaze. Yes, I should have. If you told me day one, she stopped. She let the sentence go. It was a sentence with no useful ending. He seemed to understand that. He stayed where he was, 3 feet, not closing the distance further, and he said, I'll do whatever you need me to do tomorrow. I'll follow your lead. The room is yours. She nodded. She turned back to the window. He left. She listened to his footsteps move down the hallway and stop, and then move again and fade. And she sat in the dark study and thought about tomorrow and thought about the distance between 3 feet and everything else. The sit-down was held in a private room on the 42nd floor of a building in Midtown that had a legitimate architecture firm on its signage and something else entirely on its upper floors. Lucien's driver took them in 2 cars. Sienna rode with Marco, who said nothing the entire drive, and whose silence she had come to read as a form of respect. She wore the dark suit Rosa had quietly acquired for her. She'd looked at herself in the mirror that morning for a long time. Not vanity, inventory, checking what the mirror said about who was in it. It said, a woman who had been in worse rooms. It said, a woman who had built irrefutable things from nothing. It said, a woman who was still here. She'd taken the elevator up with Lucien beside her and Marco and Fen behind them, and she'd looked straight ahead at the steel doors, and she'd thought about Reyes and the conditions she'd agreed to and the specific timing they'd arranged, and she'd checked the sequence one more time in her head and found no gaps. The room was large and severe. Long table, 12 chairs, walls without windows. 6 men seated on one side plus their attendant standing behind. Caruso was at the center, older than she'd expected from the financial documents, mid-70s, white-haired, with the specific quality of stillness that belonged to men who had spent decades not needing to prove anything. He looked at Sienna when she entered. He looked at her the way you look at a variable you hadn't planned for. Lucien sat. Sienna sat beside him. Marco and Fen stood behind. Caruso looked at Lucien. I said to come alone. I don't take instructions from you, Lucien said. I'm here because I chose to be here. She's here because she chose to be here. Something moved around the table. Not hostility exactly, more a collective reassessment. A man to Caruso's left, 50s, heavy, with a Boston accent that showed up in his first sentence, said, This is a closed proceeding. The woman's a civilian. I'm a witness, Sienna said. Her voice came out level. To the practices your organization's affiliate ran for the past 3 years. I was in their system. I have documentation of the financial structure going back to its origin. She looked at the man. If you'd like to discuss standing, I'm happy to do that. Silence. Caruso looked at her for a moment, then at Lucien, then back at her. Something was moving in his expression, calculation, but also something that might have been curiosity. All right, he said. Let's hear what she has to say. She spoke for 20 minutes. She laid it out the way she'd laid it out in her head every morning for 5 days. Clean, sequential, irrefutable. The financial architecture, the account structures, the routing signatures that connected Caruso's money to the Marchetti operations expansion over 6 years, the communication records, the evidence that he'd been funding a forced labor system with full structural awareness of what that system was. She watched their faces as she spoke. Some of them were performing neutrality and doing it badly. 2 of them, the men furthest from Caruso, were listening with an attention that sharpened as she went, the specific attention of men reassessing which side of something they wanted to be on. Caruso did not perform neutrality. He sat with his hands flat on the table in his white-haired stillness, and he looked at her and she looked back at him and she kept talking. When she finished, the room was silent. Then Caruso said, Everything you've described could be challenged. Documentation can be fabricated. Routing records can be manipulated. Without independent verification, there's independent verification, she said. A federal investigation has been running for 16 months. They have parallel documentation reaching the same conclusions. She held his gaze. And they have a copy of everything I've just described. Something shifted in the room. A specific kind of shift. The shift of a balance point moving. The Boston man said, You gave federal investigators. I gave them a copy 3 days ago, yes. She looked at him. Everything I've described is already in federal hands. Which means the question of whether Lucien violated your code by dismantling the Marchetti operation is now secondary to the question of what you do about the fact that a federal investigation with this documentation is going to move on Caruso's network within weeks. Caruso looked at her. His face had changed. Not broken, not afraid, but different. The calculation in it had shifted orientation. You understand what you've done, he said quietly. Yes. You've put every man in this room at risk. I've put one man in this room at risk, she said. The one who built a network on human exploitation and collected money from it for 6 years. She looked at him without blinking. Every other man here has a choice right now. They can align with that and share the exposure, or they can recognize that the most practical thing they can do is distance themselves from it as fast as possible. The 2 men at the far end of the table looked at each other. The Boston man looked at Caruso. Caruso looked at Sienna. You came in here, he said, with evidence that could destroy me, and you're presenting it as a choice. I'm presenting it as information. She kept her voice flat. What you do with it is your choice. Why? His eyes were very sharp. Why give me the choice? You have the federal case. You don't need anything from this room. She looked at him for a moment. She thought about 14 months. She thought about Russo's hands. She thought about the 400 people Reyes had described, the ones still in systems like the one she'd been in. Because a federal case takes time, she said. Because appeals and proceedings and legal challenges take time. And while that time passes, the operations continue. The people in them stay in them. She looked at him steadily. You can end it today. You can pull the funding from every connected operation in the next 48 hours, which is faster than any federal proceeding will ever move. She paused. That's the choice I'm giving you. The silence was the longest one yet. Caruso looked at her and she looked back at him, and she was aware of her pulse in her throat and the specific ache of her ribs, and Lucien sitting completely still beside her, and the two men at the end of the table watching Caruso with the focused attention of men making decisions. And she did not look away from Caruso. She held his eyes and let him look at whatever he needed to look at in her face. Let him take the full measure of her. He said, "Endeavoro." She said, "What about him? He violated the code. That's the reason for this proceeding. He dismantled an operation you were running on human trafficking proceeds," she said. "If you push that violation in this room, those are the terms under which it will be discussed, including with the men sitting here who aren't connected to the Marchetti affiliate." She glanced at the two men at the far end. She'd identified them in her research, the ones whose operations were separate from Caruso's financial web. And back to Caruso. "You want to make this room about whether Lucien violated an abstract rule. I'm making it about what the rule was protecting. It is what?" Caruso was silent for a very long time. Then he looked at the Boston man. The Boston man said nothing. Then he looked at the two men at the far end of the table, and one of them, older with a careful face, said, "Vittorio, this isn't a conversation I want to be part of anymore." The other one nodded. Caruso put his hands on the table and pushed himself to standing. He was still very still, very controlled. He looked at Sienna one final time. "You're more dangerous than he is," he said. It was not entirely an insult. "I'm aware," she said. He looked at Lucien. Something passed between them, old and complicated and not entirely resolved. And then Caruso turned and walked to the door, and his attendants fell in behind him, and the Boston man followed, and two others followed, and the room was suddenly less than half as full as it had been. The two remaining men looked at Sienna. The careful-faced one said, "The federal case will proceed on its own timeline," she said. "Your cooperation in distancing your operations from Caruso's network would be noted. I can't make guarantees, but I can tell you that the investigation is targeted. It follows the money. Money that goes away stops being traceable." He looked at his associate. They stood up together. "We'll be in touch," he said. They left. The room was empty except for Sienna and Lucien and Marco and Fen. Sienna sat in the chair and felt the adrenaline begin its slow recession and felt all the things her body had been holding back. The ache, the tremor in her hands she'd been suppressing for 40 minutes, the exhaustion that lived in her bones, start to surface as the suppression released. Lucien had not moved. She turned and looked at him. His face was... She didn't have a complete word for it. She had pieces of words. Relief and something else, something older and heavier, the expression of a man who had watched something extraordinary occur and was only now beginning to understand the full extent of what he'd seen. "You didn't tell me about Reyes," he said quietly. "No. You built the federal peace without me." "Yes." He looked at her. "The 3 copies. Outside this building." "Yes." "How long?" "Since day 2. She held his gaze. "I needed something that was entirely mine, that couldn't be taken." He was quiet for a moment, then, "That was smart." "I know." She turned away from him and looked at the empty room. The 12 chairs, the severe walls, the absence of the men who had been in it. And she thought about the 400 people Reyes had described. And she thought about the 48-hour window she'd given Caruso. And she thought about whether he would use it, and she thought, he will. He's a practical man. He'll use it because it's the only move that minimizes his exposure. He'll pull the funding because it costs him less than the alternative. She thought, that's not justice. It's leverage. It's not the same thing. She thought, sometimes leverage is what you have and you use what you have. She stood up. Her ribs pulled. She put her hand briefly against her left side and then dropped it. "We need to go," she said. "Sienna." His voice stopped her. She turned. He was still seated, which was unusual. She'd almost never seen him not standing when he wanted to say something serious, and he looked up at her from the chair with his careful dark eyes, and he said, "I know you have decisions to make. About everything. About me. I know the past 5 days have..." He stopped. "I just want you to know that whatever you decide, I understand it. You don't owe me anything. You never did." She looked at him. She thought about the communication record and the Upper East Side building and the 8 weeks he'd spent figuring out how to approach her, And the night in the rain, and the 40th floor, and every morning, and the pigeon, and the coffee, and all of it, the whole impossible accumulation of it. She thought, there are things worth salvaging and things that are not, and the difference between them is not always clear from inside them. She thought, you're standing in a room where you just changed the shape of something significant, and the man who helped make that possible is looking at you and waiting for nothing, asking for nothing, and you have, she finished the sentence in her head, you have to decide what you do with a man who wronged you and then spent 8 weeks trying to find a way to make it right before you ever knew his name. She didn't say it. She looked at him sitting in that chair in the empty room and she thought, not yet, not here. This room has taken enough from both of us today. Come on, she said, let's go home. She heard herself say it. Home. She hadn't meant to say that specific word. She saw it land on him. The slight change in his eyes, nothing dramatic, just a shift in the quality of his stillness, like something that had been braced against impact had been told it could stop bracing. She turned and walked to the door, and he came with her. The drive back was quiet. Marco kept his eyes on the road, and the city moved past the windows in the particular way it moved on gray afternoons, indifferent and loud, and entirely unaware that anything had happened in a room on the 42nd floor. Sienna watched it and let the adrenaline finish its recession, felt the tremor in her hands complete its cycle and subside, felt the ache in her ribs settle back to its familiar register. She thought about Caruso. She thought about whether he would move in the 48 hours she'd given him, and she thought, yes, he will move. She had read him correctly. He was a man who had survived 20 years by being pragmatic faster than his enemies, and the most pragmatic move available to him right now was exactly what she'd described. Pull the funding, distance himself from the Marchetti affiliate. Let the federal case find what it was going to find without his fingerprints still warm on it. It wouldn't save him. The documentation she'd given Reyes was thorough enough that nothing he did in the next 48 hours would save him from the federal proceeding. But it would save the people currently inside the connected operations. The 400, or whatever the actual number was, she'd never know the actual number, would find their debt structures collapsing without financial support, their enforcement mechanisms suddenly underfunded, the whole architecture of their captivity beginning to loosen at the seams. That was what she'd traded for. Not justice, not the clean ending, the fastest path to the loosening. She thought, it's not enough. She thought, it's what you had. You used it. She looked at her hands. They were still. She had steady hands. She had always had steady hands, even when everything else was shaking, and she had come to think of that as the most reliable thing about herself, that her hands stayed still when her hands needed to be still. Lucienne was looking out the other window. She could see his profile against the glass, the angular line of his jaw, the set of his shoulders, and she thought about the conversation they still needed to have. The real one, not the strategic exchange of information, not the navigation of who knew what and when, the real one, the one that would determine what came after all of this. She was not ready for it yet. She needed one more day. Reyes called at 6 that evening. Caruso's people have been in contact with 3 of the connected operations, she said, without preamble. We're seeing financial movement. It's early, but it looks like he's beginning to pull infrastructure. Sienna was sitting on the stone terrace with a glass of water and the cold evening air and the last light going out of the Hudson Valley sky. Within your 48-hour window or mine? Yours. He's moving faster than we expected. A pause. What did you say to him? I gave him a practical argument. It appears to have worked. Another pause. The federal warrants are in process. We're looking at a move on the primary accounts within 2 weeks. And the secondary operations? The 11 nodes you described? Longer. But with the funding pulled, they start degrading on their own. Some of them will collapse without enforcement support. Sienna looked at the darkening tree line. Some isn't all. No, Reyes said. It isn't. They sat with that for a moment. You negotiated well, Reyes said. Not flattery. Assessment. The terms you asked for were reasonable and strategically sound. I had good practice, Sienna said. Spending 14 months being on the wrong side of a bad contract teaches you what the good ones look like. Ms. Vale. Reyes's voice shifted slightly, lost a layer of its professional surface. What you did today. Walking into that room, the way you handled it, that's not something most people could do. I want you to know that. Sienna thought about what to say to that. Most people haven't had 14 months of practice being the least powerful person in every room, she said. Turns out that's good preparation for walking into one where everyone would rather you weren't there. A pause, then, the witness protection option remains open, at your discretion. I know. And Devereaux. She was quiet. The documentation you provided includes his financial connection to the Marchetti operation, Reyes said. The transfers, the communication record, the meeting location, we have it. I know you have it. I gave it to you. Yes? A careful pause. The investigation's scope is targeted at Caruso's network. Devereaux's connection to the Marchetti affiliate is a single data point in a much larger picture. Our focus, I understand what you're telling me, Sienna said. You're telling me that you have what you need to move on Caruso and that Lucien Devereaux is a peripheral concern in that investigation and that what happens to him is not the priority. That's accurate. And you're also telling me, without telling me, that if I wanted to push for his inclusion in the proceeding, I have the grounds. Silence. Also accurate, Reyes said. Sienna looked at the last edge of light going out of the sky. I'll be in touch, she said, and hung up. She sat on the terrace for a long time after that, until the cold had worked its way properly through the jacket, and her ribs ached steadily, and the sky was fully dark, and the lights of the house behind her were the only lights she could see. She thought about what Reyes had told her without telling her. The choice. Sitting there like the choice she'd offered Caruso in the room. Practical, actionable, irreversible. She thought about what she was actually trying to decide, and she stripped it down to its structure. The way she stripped financial documents. Removed the emotion, the history, the weight of specific memories. Looked at the core architecture, structure. A man who had participated in a system that caused harm to her. Who had found out, stopped, tried to correct it before she knew he existed. Who had then saved her life and brought her into his protection and withheld relevant information twice while genuinely believing he was protecting her. Who had, in that empty room, told her she owed him nothing and meant it. Question: was the harm intentional? Answer: the participation, no. The withholding, yes, both times. Question: did the correction matter? She sat with that one. She thought, it matters that he stopped. It matters that he spent 8 weeks before the night in the rain, trying to find a way to undo what he'd been part of. Not because it makes the harm not real, because it means something about what he does when he finds out he's caused it. She thought, that's either enough or it isn't, and you're the only person who can decide which. She went inside. She found him in the study. He was sitting at the desk not working, papers in front of him, but his eyes on the middle distance. The particular unfocused gaze of someone thinking hard about something they couldn't resolve through thinking. He looked up when she came in. She sat down across from him. She looked at his face for a moment. Really looked at it, the way she'd been avoiding looking at it for 5 days. And she said, I need you to tell me something. All right. When did you find out I was in the Marchetti system? He didn't hesitate. 14 weeks ago. 14, she calculated. 2 weeks before you said. Yes. Why did you tell me 8 weeks before? Because 8 weeks before was when I ended the financial arrangement. I told you the truth about that timing. He held her gaze. The 2 weeks before that, when I found your name in their system and hadn't yet ended the arrangement, I wasn't ready to include in the account I gave you. Why not? Because it's the worst part. His voice was flat, even. I found out you were in the system. I spent 2 weeks ending it cleanly, covering my exit so it couldn't be traced back in a way that would trigger the syndicate to take it out on their workers, on you. And that's a real thing. That was a real concern, and I handled it correctly. But it's also true that for 2 weeks I knew, and I hadn't fixed it yet, and I didn't want you to know about those 2 weeks. The room was quiet. What did you do in those 2 weeks? She said. I watched you walk past the building every morning. He looked at her. And I moved faster than I would have otherwise on getting out clean. She sat with that. The specific texture of it. 2 weeks, him at the 40th floor window, knowing, watching her carry her cheap coffee and move her hurt pigeons, knowing what she went home to at night. That's a hard thing to carry, she said. Yes. Is that why you told me about watching me? On the first night? Because you needed me to know something real about you before you could handle the possibility that I'd find out what you'd been part of. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I told you about watching you because it was true and because you deserved the truth. A pause. But, yes, I think part of it was needing you to know that the watching was real before you found out about the rest, so you'd have something to weigh it against. That's honest. I'm trying to be. She looked at the desk between them, at the papers he hadn't been reading, at his hands flat on the table, still, the way his hands were always still. I gave Reyes everything, she said, including the communication record, including the meeting location. He nodded. I know. You knew I would. Yes. And you didn't try to stop me. No. He met her eyes. I told you before, the decisions are yours. I meant it. She thought about the conversation she'd had with Reyes an hour ago, the careful framing, the peripheral concern, the choice sitting there untouched. The federal investigation is targeting Caruso, she said. Your connection to the Marchetti affiliate is documented in their file. What they do with it depends on how the case is built and what the prosecutors decide to prioritize. She looked at him. I didn't ask them to target you. I didn't ask them not to. I gave them what I had, and the decision is theirs. Something in his face, not relief, she wouldn't call it relief, something like the release of a long-held breath. That's more than I had a right to expect, he said. Yes, she said, it is. He accepted that. No defense, no softening, no attempt to close the distance between the admission and something more comfortable. He just accepted it and sat with it, and she thought, that right there. That capacity to hold something hard without trying to put it down. She thought, that might be enough. She thought, you don't decide that tonight. She stood up. I'm going to stay, she said. For now. Not because I've figured everything out, because I haven't figured everything out, and I'd rather figure it out here than somewhere else. She looked at him. But I need you to understand something. If you withhold something from me again, anything, any information you decide I'm not ready for, any timing you adjust for my benefit without my knowledge, I walk. No conversation, no second chance on it, just gone. He held her gaze. I understand. Do you? Yes. No qualifier, no conditional. She nodded. She moved toward the door. Sienna. She stopped. Thank you, he said, for today, for the room. A pause. For still being here. She stood in the doorway with her back to him, and she thought about the specific weight of those words, for still being here, the way they contained everything they contained without performing any of it. Don't thank me yet, she said. Ask me in a year. She heard something in the room behind her that might have been the smallest change in his breathing. She went to bed. 3 weeks later, federal warrants executed on 4 Caruso-linked financial institutions in New York and Philadelphia. 2 of the connected debt operations collapsed within 48 hours of the funding cut. Reyes called to tell her, and her voice had that quality it got when something she'd been building for a long time finally moved. Sienna was in a different room by then. She had spent the 3 weeks doing something she hadn't done in 14 months, thinking about what she actually wanted, not what she needed to survive, not what the next calculation required, not what was practical or defensible or safe. What she wanted. It turned out to be a stranger question than she'd expected. 14 months of pure survival had narrowed her so completely that she had to consciously widen herself back out, like a hand that had been clenched too long learning to open. She called her mother, not the sanitized version she'd been delivering for over a year, the real call, the full one, 2 hours on a Tuesday evening while she sat on the floor of the estate library with her back against the bookshelves and the lamp on and the door closed. Her mother cried. Sienna did not during the call. She did afterward, briefly, in the way she allowed herself these things, privately, completely, and then finished with it. Danny found a job. She'd helped him find it, a legitimate accounting firm in Queens that took people who were trying, which was something she'd asked Marco to locate because Marco turned out to be remarkably good at locating specific things when asked. Danny started on a Monday, and called her that evening talking faster than she could track, which was how she knew he was going to be all right. She began building the foundation. She hadn't planned it consciously. She'd been reading through the case documentation, the full scope of what Reyes had described, the 11 nodes, the 400, the years of financial architecture built on human debt. And she'd found herself mapping what a legitimate intervention structure would look like. Not a charitable gesture, not a fund with her name on it, an operational infrastructure. Legal aid for people inside debt servicing systems who didn't know they had legal recourse, financial counseling. Employment pipelines into legitimate work, modeled on what she knew from the inside of the system, built for the specific mechanics of how those systems trapped people. She showed it to Lucien on a Thursday evening, set the papers on his desk and stood back. He read for 11 minutes. She timed it. Then he looked up. You need operational funding, legal infrastructure, connections to employment networks across 5 states. Yes, I can provide all of those things. I know. She met his eyes. I'm asking, not assuming. Something in his face, that shift she'd learned to read, the one that happened when something reached him below the management of it. Yes, he said. Whatever you need. There are conditions. Tell me. The funding is clean, documented, auditable, no connection to anything that isn't legitimate. If I'm going to build something for people trying to get free of systems like the one that held me, I can't do it with money that has a shadow on it. He held her gaze. I've been in the process of restructuring my financial holdings for 6 weeks, liquidating certain assets. The capital I'd make available to this would come from the restructured side. She absorbed this. 6 weeks, she said. That's from the night you told me I don't know who I am without what I've built. He said it plainly. I've been thinking about that. She looked at him. She thought about the sit-down room and the empty chairs and the way he'd said, whatever you decide, I understand it. She thought about the 40th floor and the 2 weeks he'd carried knowing before he could fix it, and the 8 weeks after that, and all the slow, careful accumulation of a man trying to become something different without being sure he knew how. She thought, people don't change because someone believes in them. That's a story people tell. She thought, but sometimes they change because they want to, because something shows them the shape of who they could be. And the wanting is real, and the work is real, and the change is slow and incomplete and real. She couldn't give him the ending he wanted, not yet, and maybe not for a long time, but she could give him what was true. I believe you're trying, she said. He looked at her. That's enough, he said. For now. For now, she agreed. She gathered the papers. She was almost to the door when she heard him. The foundation, he said. What are you calling it? She turned. She looked at him across the study, the room where she'd found the anomaly, the room where she'd taken Reyes's call, the room where she'd come back to him after the sit-down and said, let's go home. The room that had held more truth in the past month than most rooms held in years. I haven't decided yet, she said. Something without your name on it, he said. Not a question. He'd learned to read her, too. Yes. She thought for a moment. Something about the debt being finished, the account being closed. He was quiet, thinking, then, cleared. She looked at him. The word sat in the air between them, and she turned it over. The double meaning of it. The financial register and the other one, the one that had nothing to do with money. And she thought, yes, that's exactly right. Cleared, she said, but that works. She left. She walked down the hallway and out through the entrance hall and onto the stone steps at the front of the house, where the November air was cold and clean, and the lights from inside laid long rectangles across the gravel, and the old trees stood at the edges of the lamplight, the way they'd been standing through every storm this valley had ever seen. She stood there and breathed. Deep breath, the kind that used to pull at her ribs and now only reminded her that they were almost healed. She'd seen the doctor twice since that first night, and he'd told her last week that she was close. Another few weeks, and there would be nothing left of that particular damage. She thought about Carmine Russo. She didn't know exactly what had happened to him, and she had decided, cleanly and without apology, that she didn't need to know. She thought about the things she'd said to Reyes, some isn't all. She carried that. She would always carry that. The distance between what she'd managed and what should have been possible. That was the right thing to carry. The other things, the 14 months, the weight of it, the specific memory of Russo's hands, those she was learning to set down. Not forget, set down. There was a difference, and she was learning it slowly, in the way you learn things that your body needs to unlearn before your mind can follow. She thought about Danny in his new job, talking too fast on a Monday evening. She thought about her mother's voice on the phone. She thought about 400 people and operations beginning to run dry of the money that had powered their captivity. And she thought, some, not all. Start with some. She thought about the foundation, and the word cleared, and a man in a study reading 11 minutes of plans she'd built from the inside of a system that had tried to make her nothing. She thought, you are going to build something in this city that outlasts all of it. The debt and the syndicate and the long year of survival, and even this strange and complicated and not yet finished thing with a man who watched you from 40 floors up and went to war for you and had a shadow on him that he was trying, slowly and imperfectly, to remove. You are going to build something. She went back inside. She walked back to the study. Lucienne looked up when she appeared in the doorway. She leaned against the frame and looked at him. And she said, I want to go over the funding structure tonight, all of it. I want to see exactly where it comes from. I'll have Marco pull the files. And I want you to walk me through the restructuring, what you've done in 6 weeks and what's left. That'll take a few hours. Then we should start now. She pushed off the doorframe. She came into the room and sat down at the long table, and she opened the folder, and the lamp was warm, and outside the November dark pressed against the windows, and she heard him move behind her, heard him come to the table and sit and open his own folder. And they sat together in the quiet study and began to work. Not easy. Not finished. Not the version of things where the cost had been cheap or the damage had been clean, but real. But here. But started. That was enough. For now it was exactly enough.